Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and welcome to a new episode of Keep Dreaming. Today we're going to be talking about what's in this package. For full disclosure first, this comes from Castlemania Games. This was sent to me for free for the purposes of review. So first of all, thank you very much to Castlemania Games. If you like this or any of the other stuff Castlemania Games sells, I put a link in the description. You can go check them out. So thank you again. Now, you've probably concluded what this is based on the evidence around you, plus the title of the video. But yes, we're going to be talking about a new Sega Dreamcast controller called the Striker DC. And then we'll get into a little history of it and actually review it. But let's just do the main bit here. Let's go ahead and open it up. So this shipped right out of California. And I'm very excited to try this out. This project is an interesting one. It went through crowdsourcing. It went through crowdsourcing, unlike a lot of these other controllers, but there's a reason for that. And, okay, all right, got it. Inside, we have the Striker DC gamepad, and that's it, except for some packing peanuts. I'll put those to the side. But yes, there it is, the Striker DC gamepad. Looks very nice, very cool box. And let's go ahead and, well, actually, we'll get to actually opening this box in a little bit. For now, you can just kind of admire it. So basically, what's the deal with this? What's going on? Like I said, this was a crowdfunded project that ultimately yielded in a brand new Sega Dreamcast controller. This is produced by a company called Retro Fighters. Now, they're not new to making controllers. In fact, they've made a bunch of them. I've got some of them right here on the table. The first one that at least I was aware of is this one. This is the NES Retro Fighters controller. They would later go on to make a Nintendo 64 version. I did an entire video on this as well. And this was called the Brawler 64. And this one was called the Brawler Gen, the name implying it's for the Genesis. It's actually a function with both the Genesis and the Sega Saturn. Now, the reason that I also did a video on this. Now, the reason for this is twofold. One is that the name implies Retro Fighters. A lot of these controllers were made to support fighting games on retro consoles. That's really where their heart is. And, you know, fighting games, I know people in fighting game communities are very particular about the type of controller they use. So this was kind of made with those in mind. But the other thing is they also wanted to update nostalgic experiences, retro experiences with a more modern flair. More or less not destroy your nostalgia, but upgrade it, improve it, and bring it kind of to the way you remember it being as opposed to the way it necessarily was, even though, ironically, you're actually literally changing the controller. But what I'm saying by that is modern gaming tastes have changed. People like a more standard type of controller now, hence the two grips on each side, really since the PS1 controller, or more specifically the DualShock version, as well as like, you know, the Xbox 360, Xbox One, and then of course all the PlayStation line of controllers. People have gotten more used to that wide style of controller, hence the Nintendo Switch even, and like the Wii U would use Pro controllers that used that design. But where does that leave our retro consoles? Well, thanks to Retro Fighters, they've gone back and said, hey, we can improve on some of that stuff. Because even though a lot of those controllers, I'm not saying any of them were bad, but one thing, they were made by humans, which means they weren't perfect. So you can go back and make improvements. And they did in a lot of cases. And like I've said this before, but basically for the NES, this is the way I play the NES now. Is it overly complicated for the NES? I don't know if I'd say overly complicated, but it certainly has more functionality than the NES would ever need. But the benefit of it was that you had multiple combinations in different ways to play the NES depending on the game style. And the controller just felt more comfortable over time as opposed to the way the original Square NES controller felt. The Retro Fighters N64 controller, same deal. I felt that this was a big improvement over the Trident. I actually liked the Trident controller, but I liked this a lot better, with the one exception being the thumbstick. I thought the thumbstick wasn't quite as good, although the placement of it was fine. The Brawler Gen was the funniest one to me, because the name Gen implies that the thing was marketed as a Genesis controller, which it was. However, it does have Saturn functionality. I feel like, and this is pure speculation, but I feel like it was engineered to be a Sega Saturn controller, because I didn't really like using this on the Genesis, but on the Saturn, I loved it. It's actually the way I play the Saturn now. So overall, they've found ways to improve a lot of these controllers throughout the past, in my personal opinion. Now, when it comes to the Dreamcast, I mean, there is no console that is more, especially when you make a lot of the Dreamcast videos, you just see that people demand new Dreamcast controllers. People are like, I love that console, but I hate this controller. Now, this in particular is a unique one. This is a wireless controller called the Dreamcon. I did a video on this, but of course, you know the shape. A Dreamcast controller. My position on this controller, even though people have been saying for years how much they would love a new one, like a complete redesign, was you have to understand that this controller was being developed in 1997. The whole idea of a wide berth controller was not really common yet. The DualShock, I think, had just come into existence, so it wasn't exactly the standard. By the time this was out, it was 98 in Japan. It's just, and then it launched the same model, you know, a year later in North America and Europe. And frankly, the Dreamcast just wasn't around long enough for them to ever bother doing a redesign. I've heard rumors and stories about how the original Xbox Duke was kind of the attempt for a Dreamcast upgrade controller, but then Microsoft more or less got all the components out of that, and then they more or less had to make the Duke because of that. That's a story I'm not super familiar with. I've just kind of heard stuff about that before. Anyway, the point is, if Sega had ever intended to make a newer version of this, they simply ran out of time to do so. So with the controller itself, the way it is, I always thought it was a perfectly fine controller for games that it was made for. The problem is it didn't evolve to modern gaming taste. You know, the rest of the 6th gen consoles all had the wider style controller, and of course, ever since then, with the occasional exception like the Wiimote or you know, like I guess you can call the Switch Joy-Cons, whatever. With the exception of those type of controllers, traditionally any sort of standard controller has not looked anything like this. So it's harder for modern gamers to go back and get used to this, like with the lack of a second thumbstick and all that sort of stuff. Not that the Striker DC specifically addressed that particular issue, but with that issue, it's like, well, what do you want? A second thumbstick wouldn't suddenly give the games new abilities to, you know, have free motion cameras or anything like that. It's not how it works. But that said, there was room for improvement. So the Striker DC came from that idea that we want a more modern Sega Dreamcast controller. I was also told that this one's kind of interesting because while a lot of these controllers just kind of came and were sold, this one actually had to go through crowdfunding, and it actually took a lot longer than the rest. And I was trying to figure out why that was, and I got an answer. As it turns out, a lot of Dreamcast stuff isn't made anymore. Big shock. But what is even more surprising is there are actually components still made for certain controllers. Like the NES still gets some new pieces made. The N64 still gets some new pieces made. Saturn, Genesis still gets some new pieces made throughout Asia. So when you're building something like this, there are certain parts that are readily available that you can just buy in bulk when you're actually assembling these things. But nobody was making new Dreamcast stuff, particularly things like the VMU ports. No one has put one of those in production in like 20 years. So that, you know, every single aspect of it had to be done fresh and from the beginning, which is probably, and I'm just speculating on this, but I think it's probably what's holding up the Retrobit Dreamcast controller as well, even though the other ones have all been out for a couple of years now, or at least a year now. So, yeah, interesting. But anyway, enough of that, enough of the history. Let's actually take a look at the controller itself. I like this box. It's got the nice kind of slide top here. Lift that off. Very cool that this actually exists. I'm very excited about this. Take that off. Inside, it's got some Retro Fighters information. Looks like a little sticker sheet, actually. Yeah, that's what it is. As well as a Retro Fighters FAQ. A manual, which includes a cool little keychain. And then the manual just has some information about it. It says, the goods. The Dreamcast system holds a special place in our gaming collection. It is one of our favorite consoles of all time. We wanted to make a controller for the Dreamcast that has an ergonomic feel to it with modern features and designs. We also added shoulder buttons and extra turbo functions, which is nice. But yes, it has full you know, a VMU and Rumble support, I presume. I'll have to obviously test that, but I imagine it's all there. It has a nice little breakdown of the actual controller. So you've got the turbo mode, you've got the clear mode, which I assume resets the turbo, analog stick, D-pad, start button, you know, A, B, Y, and X button, and then the shoulder buttons as well as triggers. So that's probably just to make it more dual functional. But yes, again, I will tinker with it some more and actually check it out. But taking it out of the case there, see if there's anything underneath all this. I'm imagining there isn't, but no, there's nothing underneath that. So we can just put that to the side. So we have the actual controller. Ooh, very smooth. I like that. It actually looks, I mean, obviously it wasn't made by Sega, but it looks very much like something they could have produced. I like this. I like the feel of this. So we can take the VMU, pop it in there, take the Rumble pack, the jumper pack, pop it in there. That adds a lot of weight to it, but that's to be expected. But I like it. I like it. I think it's solid. I think the thumbstick's good, pause button's good. It all feels pretty good. So I've been using this thing for a while now, and it's time for final thoughts. Now, here's the thing. The short version is, I think this is a really good controller. I really like the experience with it. I only had a small problem with it initially, which I do not attribute to the controller itself. And there's only one thing about it I think I would actually change, but that's more of a me thing as opposed to what the controller was intended to do. So we'll start off like this. I ended up playing a bunch of different games with it. I tried out, the first thing I tried was Sonic Adventure. Now, I love Sonic Adventure. It's a game I've been playing since before the Dreamcast even came out. You know, I mean, it's a game I'm very familiar with. I love that game. And obviously, I've been very used to it playing it with this the standard controller. Now, I had a problem with this thing initially, but I don't attribute it to the controller. My Dreamcast, I swear it has like a ghost in it or something. It was acting so ridiculous today with issues with the DC HDMI, issues with the GDMU, issues with the controller, issues with just everything. It was like ridiculous how many problems I was having. I'll spare you the details. But once I got it working, the only time I ran into an issue with the controller is I would be on the GDMU screen and I would be going down like looking for the game, and then all of a sudden it would just stop responding. And I was like, what's up with that? That only happened once, and I don't know what was up with that. And it never happened again. Later, I would actually be playing Sonic Adventure, and everything was going fine. And then I kind of noticed that I was like, I beat the first level, and I was like, that felt strange. Something about that felt abnormal, and I don't mean just holding the controller. I mean something else about it was off. And then I realized, like, it never vibrated. Not once. I had the jump pack and the memory card, the VMU, both in there at the same time, as you can see right now. And it never vibrated. And I was like, I'm pretty sure muscle memory is telling me that the game should have been vibrating that whole level. So I turned off the console. I plugged in a traditional Dreamcast controller, and I got a completely different jump pack, and I started playing the game. And sure enough, it started vibrating, and I was like, I'm pretty sure this thing supports vibration, so what's up with that? Turned it off again, turned it back on with this controller and a different jump pack. Then it all worked fine. So I was like, oh, okay, the jump pack itself just died? That seems really unlikely, but I guess that's what happened. Then I turned it off, turned it back on with this jump pack, which was the bad one, and all of a sudden it started working again. Again, I don't attribute this to the controller. It was, like I said, you have no idea how many issues I had with the Dreamcast today. It didn't want to play nice with me today. But after I got past these issues, never had a single problem with the controller whatsoever. It played everything perfectly smoothly. I had a very good experience with it. Playing Sonic Adventure, I had to get a little bit more used to that particular type of controller layout just because I'm not used to playing Sonic Adventure that way. But it was fine. I really like how they have these two sets of both triggers and the bumpers. They are the same function. These are not like extra buttons. They replicate exactly the same thing. It's just game specific and, you know, basically preference specific. You can do it whichever you prefer, which we'll kind of get back to that. They added turbo functionality, and we'll talk about that a little bit more towards the end. But basically the idea with the turbo functionality is pre-programming combinations. So you can, for example, if you're playing Mortal Kombat Gold, you can pre-program a certain series of buttons that will allow you to do a fatality like immediately. That's what that's there for. It's in the name, Retro Fighters. That's what they care about, so it makes sense that they would include that. So I never really got much use out of the turbo function, to keep it real with you. The triggers, though, I liked. I felt that was useful depending on the game. So the next game I played actually was Dead or Alive 2, Limited Edition, the Japanese version. It's much better. I played a lot of that, really liked that game, and it was a very smooth experience with this. You can tell that's where their heart was the fighting games, because it was just flawless. I really liked it. I also tried a racing game. I did Star Wars Episode 1 Racer, which worked very nice, was very smooth. I felt like I actually was doing better in that game with this controller than I would have with the original. I also played I played a shoot 'em up. I played Castle of Shikigami 2, or Shikigami no Shiro 2. And that one worked, again, perfectly smoothly. That's a game where the D-pad is how you play the game. You do not play it with the thumbstick. In fact, the thumbstick does nothing in that game. And then after that, I decided to play, of course, my game. I played Shenmue. I know, right? You probably never heard me talk about it before. But I played Shenmue with that thing. That was the first time ever where everybody complains about the controls in Shenmue, the tank controls. I never had a problem with it. I was just so used to it. But playing it with this controller, I was like, whoa! Like, instinct kept trying to get me to use the thumbstick. And infamously, that game, you don't move with the thumbstick, you move with the D-pad. So it's just like, it felt off to try and play it with the thumbstick, with the D-pad. And I eventually got used to it, but initially it was just like, as if I had never played the game before in my life. But after you kind of get over some of those hurdles, it ends up just becoming a Dreamcast controller and becomes a better Dreamcast controller, a more comfortable one that worked with everything I played with it. So as far as some of the features, I didn't mention, it's compatible, or at least it claims to be compatible with just about everything, VMU and third-party memory devices, as well as jump packs and all that sort of stuff. I didn't test every single version, but there's no reason they shouldn't work. If it's functional, it's functional. But I guess there's always the possibility of some oddball one that doesn't work that they hadn't planned on. But it also, one thing that's interesting about it is I have decided, I'm going to make this bold claim, it's going to be the way I play the Dreamcast now. This is going to be the controller I use. It will actually be replacing the Dreamcon. I like the Dreamcon a lot because it was a wireless controller using the original Dreamcast molding and everything, but the battery life on it was never that great, and you had the advantage of being able to sit at a distance with this thing as opposed to the original Dreamcast controller. But this also solves that problem. Even though it's wired, it's a 10-foot cable. Like, realistically, you're not ever going to need to deal with that anything further. But if you want to or need to, I tested it with extension cables, and it works too. So, you'll get plenty of foot length out of this thing if you really need to. So, it's unlikely you're playing in a setup where you would ever need more than 10 feet. And if you actually do, again, that would work as well. So, that's very cool. Now, when it comes to the only thing I did not like about it, which is, this is more of a criticism of a change that I would like to see, but I can't actually fault them for this because this was never something they intended or promised. It's just something I personally would prefer. So as I mentioned, they have the turbo mode for those type of moves. Now, again, retro fighters. It makes sense why they have that. It's a fighting controller. But, honestly, I'm never going to use that feature. You know what feature would be really cool? The button's already there, the molding is there. Maybe this is possible. Maybe it's not. Maybe I'm waxing inane and this is not even possible. But what I would like to do is replace the functionality of the turbo button and have a button that swaps the functionality of the D-pad and the joystick. And the reason for that would be games like Shenmue, games like Castle of Shikigami no Shiro, you could play them with the thumbstick in that scenario. Again, I'm not an engineer. I don't even know if that's totally possible. I'm assuming it is because the Saturn controller did that. It replicated the thumbstick with the D-pad and vice versa. They just work at the same time. This is not that case because obviously in the Dreamcast case, games would support both at the same time doing different functions. But is it possible to press a button to swap them so that in case of games like Shenmue or Castle of Shikigami 2, where you really don't need one of them, the other one can just be swapped? If there is any sort of revision too, that's what I personally would like to see changed about it. But that's not really a detriment to the controller itself because they never claimed it was going to do anything like that. They made the ultimate Dreamcast fighting controller. That's what it's for. But as just a casual controller for any other genre, again, I liked it perfectly fine. It's just, wouldn't it be cool if you could swap those? But that's really all else I have to say on it. I think it's a really solid experience. I really quite enjoyed it. I hope you guys will check it out. Again, there's a link in the description. Thank you so much to Castlemania Games for hooking me up with this. If you guys could please like, comment, and subscribe, I appreciate that. Check the social media stuff in the description. Thank you very much, and I'll see you all later.